Good morning and welcome. We are delighted to have you join us for today's global conversation. The theme for today's conversation is feeding the world, and we will have an opportunity to hear from colleagues contributing to this goal from a diversity of perspectives and contexts. Our global conversation series was developed to foster dialogue and build community amongst people interested and engaged in international work related to agriculture and the life sciences. We'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for today's program, UW's Institute for Regional and International Studies, National Resource Center, and the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program, and to our speakers for sharing their work with us. Your host today is Dr. Aurelie Rakotandrafara, an associate professor in the Department of Plant Pathology. Aurelie graduated with a BS degree in microbiology from University of Antananarivo, sorry, in Madagascar, followed by an MS degree in plant pathology and a PhD in molecular cellular developmental biology from Iowa State University. Her research focuses on mechanisms used by plant viruses to control their gene expression and to avoid plant defense responses, using cereals and potato as model systems. She collaborates with Obihiro University of Agriculture and Veterinary Medicine in Japan on research on plant virus transmission in the potato. She leads the UW Food Systems and Environment in Northern Japan Study Abroad program and has joined the CALS Global Committee in 2020. Please feel free to put questions in the chat at any time, including who they are for. We will engage with the questions following the presentations. Please note the session is being recorded. And without further ado, your host, Aurelie.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, perfect. So it's really my great pleasure to moderate today's global conversation. And as Jennifer mentioned, our goal of this series is really to catalyze interaction and opportunity for community building at the international level. So feed the world. So with an expected population of more than 9.8 billion in the next 30 years, can we sustainably grow enough food, healthy, nutritious food, to feed the entire world with less resources, less land, and also without destroying our planet? So since the dawn of tool making, agriculture, and industrialization, we were able to meet our carrying capacity through mechanization of agriculture, crop domestication, science of plant breeding, introduction of pesticide, fertilizer, chemical warfare, as well as genetic technology. But one key issue is, can we grow food more than we've ever done in history? So particularly with this major explosion in population growth in the past decades. And also with the current challenges in agriculture that we're facing, including climate change, as all of us scarcity of various resources. So today, the idea is, could we, in response to the environmental and climate change, are the management of pollinators using artificial intelligence, particularly the pollinators are key important for 1/3 of the global food supply? Or is the switch to this Kernza, this, I would call it a super crop, as you can see, with 10 feet roots that can absorb every nutrient and is like one of the first perennial crop, are those part of a global solution? So with that, I'm really happy to introduce our first speaker, who is like a James Crall. So I will stop the sharing here. And what I want to do is to pin James so we can all appreciate him. And so James' bio, so he joined UW Madison in January 2021, right in the middle of a pandemic, I can imagine, as an assistant professor in the Department of Plant Pathology. He earned his PhD in organism and evolutionary biology from Harvard University. And before coming to UW earlier this year, he was a Rockefeller Foundation Planetary Health Alliance Fellow and a USDA NIFA postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. His research really focuses on better understanding how global environment changes are impacting bees and other pollinators, and trying to develop better tools to monitor and promote the health of a pollinating insect and as well as ecosystem service that they provide in agrosystem. And today, his talk will focus on some of those developing projects aiming at using emerging technology or artificial intelligence to promote the health and management of bees and other pollinator. So James, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for the warm introduction. And it is absolutely, fantastic to be here. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Do you guys see that? Okay. Great, good. So thanks again for the introduction. It's really fantastic to be invited to the conversation today. And so what I'm going to tell you about today, as Orly mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Entomology, and it just started in January. So it's been really great to sort of continue connecting with the university more broadly in some very strange times. So it's great to see everybody virtually today. And today I'm going to tell you about some work within the context of these sort of grand challenges that Orly introduced, trying to describe some projects that we're really starting up both locally within the lab, but also with, we think, global connections and potential, specifically on the theme of trying to harness new and emerging technologies around computer vision and automation, and whether or not that can help us promote pollinators and the ecosystem services they deliver in agriculture as we try to both promote biodiversity and also intensify agricultural production in the next century. So why are we talking about pollinators in a feeding the world session here? As was mentioned already, pollinators are critically important for about a third of food production. So roughly a third of global food supply comes from crops that depend to some extent on animal pollination, and that's probably primarily insects and bees. And in existing systems, lack of sufficient pollination is a really critical issue for pollinator-dependent crops, potentially resulting in yielding about a quarter of the existing yield gap. So the difference between realized yields and potential yields, maybe a quarter of that is due to insufficient pollination. So a really large scale issue. And this is, of course, critically important, not just for calories, but also for human health. And that's because pollinator-dependent crops tend to be trees, nuts, fruits, and vegetables that are particularly important for human health. And a recent study, a modeling study, found that basically if we think of a scenario of catastrophic pollinator loss, that would increase by millions the annual deaths on the planet, primarily due to the loss of critical micronutrients like vitamin A and folate that are in pollinator-dependent crops. But that's sort of compared to our current situation, but there's also, in some sense, that underestimates the health impacts of pollination, because we could be doing a lot better. And so another recent sort of synthetic study found that if we want to be moving to a healthier, more sustainable diet, that's going to include a really significant increase in vegetable, fruit, and nut production. And so that means when I see those numbers, what I think is that means our food system is going to become even more pollinator dependent. Okay, so who actually does, when we say pollination in agroecosystems, who do we mean? Most likely when we say bees, I would guess that most of the audience here would have thought first about honeybees. They're a critically important pollinator that is primarily managed, actually not native here in North America, but they're widely used, certainly the single most important species of pollinator in agriculture globally. But there are lots of other bees and other insects and other animal pollinators on the planet, including many other managed species. So in addition to honeybees, there are multiple species of bumblebees, which are another social bee, but also solitary bees. So many species beyond just honeybees that are actually actively managed and domesticated and used in both small scale and large scale agriculture. And in addition to those sort of actively managed and domesticated bees, there's an enormous number of wild pollinators that are critically important for both basic ecosystem function, but also delivery of pollination services on farms. And so overall, there's about 20,000 species of bees. We normally think about honeybees as sort of the one really important one, but there's a phenomenal diversity of pollinators, and that's just bees. That's not talking about moths and butterflies and all the other different kinds of even vertebrate pollinators that are critically important. And one thing we've learned more and more about recently is that diversity is functionally important. So it's not just nice to preserve biodiversity, it's actually incredibly important for food production for a couple reasons. One, bees do different things. So for example, there are certain kinds of crops that can only be pollinated by or can't be pollinated by honeybees, it can only be pollinated by bumblebees. And so that diversity is actually important for the delivery of ecosystem services. But also, one of the really critical things is thinking about the sort of insurance and diversity we get from having multiple species that can provide this really important ecosystem services to pollinator dependent crops. So if we think about having our whole food system dependent largely on one species of pollinator, that's a pretty risky approach. If, say, diseases emerge, which now we've had, totally highlighted in our world in the past year or so. So having that diversity not only is important in the short term, but also really important for the long term as we experience more and rapidly changing environmental conditions. And of course, the critical importance of pollinators has led to really substantial concern when in the last few years we've seen reports of sort of dramatic declines in the insect populations, sometimes coined the insect apocalypse. So, there's a lot of now growing public concern over declining insect populations and what that means. And they even make it into media sometimes. So this was a wonderful last minute. If anybody signed on early, they would have might have heard some excerpts. I'll thank Valentin for bringing this to my attention, which I didn't know about. But a new ABBA album had a song called Bumblebee. And in this ABBA song, which you might have heard, were the lyrics specifically about being trapped in a world where all is changing too fast for bumblebees to adapt. So this is very much in the common consciousness. And although I'd say there's some questions about how catastrophic some of the claims might get a little overblown, there is really growing consensus that there's substantial insect declines and they are taxonomically widespread. So this is a really significant concern. So we are, of course, changing the environment in many ways that impact bees and other pollinators, introducing novel pesticides, changing the abiotic conditions of the planet through climate change, introducing and transferring novel diseases, and of course, altering landscapes primarily through agricultural landscape changes, which includes both the nutritional resources and also the habitat necessary for bees. So all of those act alone, but also in combination to have direct impacts on pollinators. So this is just one example of bumblebees. those stressors can impact the biology, physiology, behavior, and also sort of health of both individual, but also in the case of social bees, sort of whole colonies of bees. So they have these direct impacts, but of course, ultimately, what we care about from a food production perspective is what that does to the composition of pollinator communities, how they interact with plants, and what that means for ultimately crop yields. So something that we're very interested in that set of challenges, trying to understand what stressors do to bees and what those changes mean for population health, diversity, and ecosystem services, is we're generally very interested in trying to develop approaches that can scale, that can sort of work efficiently across systems, and that are low cost and reproducible. So we think this is so important in part because there's an enormous diversity of pollinators. They're small, they move really fast, and they're challenging to study compared to some other systems, especially when you have sort of whole collectives of individuals where what we really care about is the health of sort of the whole colony, either for bumblebees or honeybees. So one of the tools we've been trying to add into this tool belt is a low-cost system for automatically quantifying behavior in bumblebee colonies. And this has really been led by a grad student in the lab, August Easton Calabria, and also really substantially supported by an undergrad researcher, Madison. And we're really trying to, again, use computer vision to automate the quantification of behavior in bumblebee colonies. So for example, this is a video, hopefully you can all see that, of individually tracked bees moving around inside of a bumblebee colony. They're smaller than honeybee colonies. That's one of the reasons they're nice to work with in the lab. And with this kind of approach, we can automatically track the movements, interactions, behaviors, and also growth of colonies over time without sort of labor-intensive manual methods that have traditionally been used. And again, one of the things we're really excited about is this is very low cost. So now we can do this basically on a computer and a camera that costs just a few $100s. So that's fun because we can do it, without having to have monster grants. But really importantly, what we're excited about it being sort of low cost is that means that lots of labs hopefully should be able to build them. So what we're in the big picture interested in doing is trying to make these approaches open source, something you could just, for a few $1,000s, have some automated behavioral quantification and start using that, transferring it to other labs and other systems to try and understand in a really broad way the health and behavior of bumblebees. And so one of those applications sort of transfers to another system that we've been able to start exploring with the generous support of a garden grant from the CALS global group, has been trying to expand that system and try to see whether or not we can use it to understand the health of an emerging pollinator used for agroecosystems in Mexico. So currently in Mexico and throughout Mesoamerica, Bombus impatiens, which is our sort of common eastern bumblebee, it's what we use in the lab here, is used for pollination in especially commercial greenhouses, for example, for tomato production. It works perfectly well as a pollinator, but one of the challenges is that it's not native to Mesoamerica, so we're largely shipping them in from other regions, and that, of course, introduces risk of disease. So we know that there's high disease loads in these commercially reared species, but also we don't want to be transferring those diseases across regions. And also there's substantial risk, even in sort of controlled environment agriculture, we know there's very substantial risk of accidental introduction of those species out into the natural environments. And so, we've seen a couple of examples of this, an introduced species in Patagonia that is sort of going wild, a new introduction into British Columbia of another species that some of these commercially used species can do very well as invasives. And so we want to avoid that. So it would be great to have a native bumblebee species that we could use for production in Mexico. And there is luckily a really abundant and good potential species for this, Bombus epphippiatus. And so what we've been doing is developing a collaboration with the group of Remy Van Dam at El Colegio de la Frontera Sur in San Cristobal, Mexico, where they have been really pioneering the techniques for bringing this new species in the lab and trying to use it in commercial agriculture. And so what we're interested in is trying to take some of the approaches for understanding the behavioral impacts of stressors on bumblebees and see if we can apply them to the species to improve management. And one of the questions we're especially interested in is what the effects of neonicotinoids are on this species. So this could be its own long seminar, but I'll try and keep myself brief on this one because it's a huge issue that we think about a lot. But neonicotinoids are an incredibly important global stressor for bees, honeybees, and all the other 20,000 species of bees. So this is data from an experiment or a study where they brought in honey from as many places as they could across the globe and then just tested them for neonicotinoids. And the takeaway here is that the vast majority of samples have at least some level of neonicotinoids. And so exposure is very widespread. And these are compounds that work to target basically the main excitatory neurotransmission system in the insect central nervous system. So really widespread impacts that don't show up in traditional metrics of toxicity. And in previous work, what we found using some of these automated behavioral approaches is that these low levels of continuous exposure can impact really critical behaviors in bumblebee colonies, like their social interactions, their ability to thermoregulate, and those can impact in the long run, but in subtle ways, the health and growth of colonies and therefore populations. But one thing we're really interested in is thinking about whether or not sensitivity to these pesticides might vary across geographies or species or populations. So that's one of the specific things we're interested in Bombus epphippiatus. More generally, there's an enormous diversity of bumblebees. They're sort of cold weather specialists. They're a sort of tundra species, this more tropical and however epphippiatus species, but also species throughout the Amazon and individual species that span that range. And that diversity is increasingly being taken advantage of for commercial pollination. Many of these species are either already commercially managed or sort of under development. And this is not an exhaustive list. There's many other species being added to this. And so understanding the strengths and weaknesses and relative sensitivities of those species is going to be really important for food production. And at the end, I just want to throw in a quick note about another project. So mainly I told you about that work is basically focused on trying to understand the proximate effects of novel stressors on bumblebee colonies, but we're also developing tools to go out in the field and use computer vision to monitor pollinators in the wild. And so what you're going to see here is a video of a bumblebee coming to visit a flower, and that was automatically triggered on a low-cost camera out in the field using a deep learning sort of computer vision network. And what's really exciting about this is there's some new approaches that actually let us get down to species level in bumblebees at least. So this is an example of a study that actually came out from a group at UW-Madison, developing neural networks that can identify to species level bumblebees in North America. And we've found that with this system, we can basically try to automatically identify who's visiting where. And with postdoc Matt Smith and another undergraduate researcher in the lab, Julia Wiesing, we've been this past summer trying to apply some of those tools by basically embedding systems out in real agricultural systems. So just to finish up here, I want to highlight that in the big picture, what we're really interested in is trying to develop approaches for automating the monitoring and therefore sort of promotion of insect biodiversity on farms by developing approaches in the lab where we can understand the proximate effects of stressors, but also combine those with tools in the field that we can use for sort of monitoring biodiversity and use those in tandem to sort of develop a equivalent of precision ag for pollination? Can we really get a better sense and develop better management strategies for food production? And with that, I just want to acknowledge the many co-authors and collaborators on this, funding sources, especially from CALS Global. And with that, I think I've spoken too long, so I'll stop myself, but looking forward to questions after.
Great. Thank you so much, James. And yes, we're going to please keep your question at the end after the second speaker, and you can use the chat Q&A question to post them. So now it is really my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Valentin Picasso. So Valentin is an associate professor in the agronomy department here at UW, and he has an adjunct professorship at the University of Uruguay. Valentin graduated with a PhD in sustainable agriculture from Iowa State University. Wow, the second ISU. And his research focused on forage and perennial grain, resilience to climate change, ecological intensification of dairy and the beef grazing system. And of particular, one particular focus and the topic of today's conversation is about Kernza, this Kernza, I guess I don't know how to pronounce it, this first perennial grain crop in the world. So Valentin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. So today I mainly want to share some of the research we've been doing with Kernza, which is the first perennial grain in the world. But also focusing on some of the collaborations we have around the world and some of the projects we have to what we call Kernza Going Global, trying to promote the research on this alternative in many different places. And for that, I just organized this talk first, thinking about the process of creating these global connections and how when I was preparing this presentation and reflecting about all the connections we have already, and it's what was the process, and hopefully that can serve to inspire or to help reflect to other programs that are interested in more global connections and more international connections. So I would say we first start with an innovative, transformative idea, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about, the idea of perennial grain crops as an innovative, transformative idea. And then, of course, solid scientific research. I mean, we had a lot of questions, and we still have a lot of questions, and you know, we had to get a lot of research in the field and in the lab. But also the third thing is the need for global collaboration. If we really want to transform agricultural systems to meet the challenges of today and the future, we really need global collaboration. And the expansion of perennial grains is certainly an obvious example of that. And so how we go about that is what I want to give several real diversity of examples. One thing is I have been very intentional in the sense of actively seeking international collaborations and taking advantage of mutual benefit opportunities for both the research I'm doing and the researchers from the other end of the world. And I think a diversity of approaches is important. It's diversity in bumblebees is important, diversity in agricultural landscapes is important, and diversity of approaches for collaboration is also important. The other thing, this takes time and patience and a lot of failed examples in order to get some successes. And it also needs, and that's why I both want to thank and emphasize the importance of CALS global support. I mean, the need for administrative support, the need for people who helps with this process of engaging global connections. So just a brief introduction on Kernza and how we got into this mess. This is a 1-minute history of global food production about different places of the world, 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, we humans domesticated annual grain crops. We domesticated rice, corn, wheat, barley, and other grain crops. And that led to basically the start of civilization, and we were able to feed a lot of people and start living in cities and expanding communities, growing population, developing society structure and whatnot. And eventually, with the advent of new technologies from mechanization, chemical, and basically the whole industrialization of agriculture after the Industrial Revolution, we were able to make tremendous increases in yields of food production, and basically all based on oil or fossil fuel derivatives like pesticides, chemicals, oil itself. And that came with a lot of environmental degradation. We cut forests, we destroyed natural ecosystems, we polluted we had a lot of soil erosion in the fields that eventually put a lot of nutrients in the waterways and in the rivers and in the lakes and in the estuaries, and we got a lot of water pollution and eutrophication and destruction of biodiversity. So we are in a situation that we really need alternatives, and there's a lot of approaches that are really trying to find alternatives to the failed environmental problems of agriculture. And the idea of perennial grains came as one of those alternatives that says, well, maybe what we did 10,000 years ago of domesticating annual grains that per se require year after year planting and harvesting and leaving the soil bare, exposed to soil erosion and therefore nutrient leaching and water pollution and a host of other environmental issues. Maybe if we move to perennial crops, that is crops that you plant once, but then you harvest year after year without the need of replanting, that they are covering the ground continuously year round and year after year, maybe that's a way of stopping all this environmental degradation. And Kernza, intermediate wheatgrass, it's a perennial cool season grass that has been, it's a wild grass from Central Europe and Central Asia, and it was introduced in the U.S. for forage production and for protection of landscapes, mainly grown in the West, and in the last 30 years has been developed for increasing seed yield, and so now it's not just a forage crop that you can harvest biomass for forage, but now you can also harvest grain and a decent amount of grain. Still, it's way lower yields than the annual grains, but it gives this dual purpose. We harvest forage that can feed to cattle. We harvest grain that can be used for cereals, for beer, for flour, for pasta, for different goods. And of course, we deliver all these ecosystem services of soil, controlling soil erosion, absorbing nutrients, fixing carbon in the soil, and so on. So in my lab, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I've been doing several research projects since I came here 6 years ago, looking at how farmers who started growing Kernza, what are the challenges, what are the needs, what are the opportunities, what are their motivations. We looked at forage nutritive value and digestibility of Kernza wheatgrass in monoculture and with legumes, because we want to grow this not as a monoculture, but also with more diversity. We want to grow it with perennial legumes that can, among other things, attract bumblebees. And we look at other agronomic management practices, weed suppression. This have the ability to control weeds. How does nitrogen fertilization and structural carbohydrates impact Kernza production? How can we reduce the height so that we don't have that much lodging and we can increase grain yields? What post-harvest management practices can impact the subsequent yields, because one of the problems we found with the perennial grain intermediate wheatgrass is that the first year it's decent yields, but then the yields go down year after year. So what can we do to manage that? And of course, in order, if we really are thinking about a global transformation of agricultural systems, if we're really thinking that perennial grains can be an alternative to annual grains and a way to diversify agriculture and improve ecosystem services, we need a global collaboration. We need to grow this in many places. We need not only to grow it in many places, but the expertise of scientists from all over the world to try to solve the challenges that this alternative brings. And so one of the things is we started wondering where can we grow Kernza and around the world. And Kernza, just like winter wheat, has vernalization and photoperiod requirements, so it requires cold winters in order to flower and to set seed. So we started thinking, okay, we can use the map of where wheat is grown today and try to start testing Kernza in those regions. We also did research here in our greenhouse in different environmental conditions to test what are the optimal temperature and photoperiod requirements, and we started actively seeking collaborators around the world to test this idea. And so what I'm going to focus on the next minutes of my talk is give you just some of the examples of how did that happen. And so I here in this map I've highlighted places where today we have Kernza UW collaborators working on testing and developing the Kernza intermediate wheatgrass. And I must say, this is only the Kernza UW collaborators. Of course, there's been other researchers in the US, and of course the Land Institute, which is the research institution where Kernza started. Of course, they have a lot of other connections and partnerships around the world. But I just want to focus on some of the examples that I've been involved with. And mainly just as a reflection of what do we need in order to make these collaborations. My reflection is, I think we need a diversity of approaches, and it's not all about like getting a big grant to do this. We can do this with different levels of funding. And so I'm going to share examples from China, Uruguay, Ukraine, Mali, Turkey, Pakistan, France, Sweden. All of them have a different type of collaborator, a different type of funding, and a different type of relationship with UW-Madison. In some cases, it was a visiting scholar that came for a short period of time. Some other cases, it was a graduate student from another country, and some other cases, a faculty. And in some other cases, we actually have projects with funding to do the research, okay? And that's what I want to encourage you to think about is how can we, in whatever field we are, really promote more of these global connections. So I want to start with the collaboration we had with Dr. Shenfei Dong from Nanjing in China. Shenfei came as a visiting scholar for a year to UW-Madison, and she developed a lot of research in the greenhouse. We published a paper out of her research, and then when she came back to China, she started testing Kernza, and she has some fields right now looking at Kernza mainly for forage use. Another example, Andres Locatelli from the Universidad de la República in Uruguay. He's a PhD student that I'm supervising, and he was a visiting scholar here at UW-Madison for 3 months, and now he's doing field research in Uruguay with Kernza. He's looking at adaptation. He's breeding Kernza for adaptation to conditions in Uruguay, and he's comparing forage yield and the effect of nitrogen and the effect of Kernza on weed suppression, as well as looking at how a greenhouse study that happened here in UW-Madison, where we look at how the number of weeks of cold in the winter would impact the flowering and the yield or the grain production of Kernza. So that's another example. He actually applied for a research grant in Uruguay and got funding from the National Agency of Research and Innovation in Uruguay for a project on Kernza that we're collaborating. And the first paper he just was accepted in Crop Science a couple of weeks ago. Another example of collaboration is with the Uman National University in the Ukraine. This is a very important collaboration because actually it's very close to the center of origin of intermediate wheatgrass, and so we're very interested in this connection. This collaboration actually started with professors from the university in Ukraine contacting us for a Ukraine-US research grant proposal in, I think it was 2017. We put together a research proposal. It didn't got funded, but nevertheless, we still engaged in the collaboration. We sent them seeds of intermediate wheatgrass. They tested it in their conditions. They documented the phenology and the growth and the yield. And now they are starting a new round of experiments on Kernza in Ukraine. And we're very interested in that connection. And again, this was something that started as a research proposal that didn't get funded, and we still were able to conduct part of the research there. Another example, Tierno Diallo from Bamako in Mali. Tierno is both director of Gamu Farms, which is a teaching and research farm in Mali, but he's also a research specialist here in the agronomy department, and he was interested in testing Kernza in the very warm and conditions of Mali. We sent him seeds there. It as was in a way a little bit expected, it didn't do very well in Mali, but we're still interested in figuring out what are the conditions for this perennial grain or even perennial as a forage in Mali. And again, this was completely unfunded and a collaboration based on the opportunity of the connection. Another example was with Professor Mohamed Zakiroglu. He is a professor in the University of Adana Turkis in Turkey. And he was a visiting scholar during 2018-19 in my lab. He also published a paper looking at some of the research we did here on the greenhouse. And now as a professor in Turkey, he's also working on some Kernza research in the area, which is an important area for research. Another visiting scholar, Abdul Mannan, a PhD student in the University of Punjab in Pakistan. He came here funded by the Higher Education Commission from Pakistan in 2018 as a visiting scholar. He gave talks and participated in teaching and engaged in some greenhouse research. And now he is back in Pakistan and he is starting a research project on Kernza too. So again, this was funding from the government of Pakistan, and that started the exchange. Two research projects that are actually starting now. One is with Olivier Duchesne, who is associate professor in France, in Isard à Lyon. And we applied together for a Thomas Jefferson Fund. It's a fund that gives money for exchanges between France and the US. And we're starting a project on looking at Kernza phenology, and that it's going to involve him visiting here next spring, and I'm going to be visiting there in next fall. And then finally, this is a very exciting project. It's a proposal we put together with some colleagues in Sweden on the Elisabeth Nadeau and Lydia Maria Martinsson, who are professors in the SLU. We put together a research proposal for funding on expanding Kernza. We actually have farmers who are growing, have planted Kernza in Sweden, and we're planning to look at adaptation, but also intercropping and forage quality of different harvest management in Kernza. So this is, if gets funded, it's going to be the basis for a long-term collaboration too. And that's where I'm going to be doing my sabbatical next year too. So just again, as a close-up, I want to show again this slide on how, I mean, we start with an innovative research, scientific research, and the need for global collaboration, and being intentional and taking advantage of win-win situations, mutual benefit opportunities with a diversity of approaches, and administrative support. Over time, we can really get to this long-term collaboration. So with that, I'd like to thank you for the attention, but also to all the collaborators, some of them who have joined us today in the connection. So thank you all very much.
Fantastic. And thank you. So now we're going to start our discussion, and thank you for all of you who already posted like your questions. So I will go over like one by one. So we'll start with the first question, and this is for James from Thierno Diallo. Can we one day see prairie or bee strips like on your final slide being mandated as part of ag here or globally, as well as the refuge field pushed by USDA to mitigate pest resistance to pesticides?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question and a super interesting one. So there's very quickly growing interest and sort of recognition that it's not just sort of what pesticides we use that are impacting bees. It's really this integrated system where we need habitat and food if we want to support the delivery of ecosystem services, especially from wild bees in agroecosystems. So there's, yeah, really growing interest in introducing these sort of native habitats within agroecosystems in an integrated way. And there's now a pretty strong body of evidence clearly showing that they help, they can bring in bees, they sort of support delivery of pollination services. Now we're at the stage where there's a bunch of really practical questions that are still open, like things like, how long does it take for that population to show up? How variable is it across regions? What's the sort of spatial scale even of how far away from those native habitats you get delivery of ecosystem services, and how we sort of trade off the biodiversity benefits from the crop production benefits. Yeah, so I think there's potential, and we're certainly seeing a growing number of projects interested in sort of pushing that direction and a growing knowledge body. In terms of the specific question about being mandated or not, I think that's a really interesting and challenging one. There's certainly more growers themselves are getting interested in sort of experimenting with. There's a lot of creativity around trying to, given the sort of broad public recognition of bees, especially, and the love that is not just mine for fuzzy bumblebees and honeybees across the globe. There's a lot of really genuine interest in creating those habitats. But I do think we will probably need, if we really want to get to the scale that is necessary for you know, both supporting biodiversity and also making sure we have those ecosystem services reliably in the future, I would put my money on needing some kind of regulatory system. What that looks like, I think there's not really clear, like there's some development of, for example, agri-environment schemes, especially in the European Union. So there are sort of growing ideas out there. I don't think we're particularly close to it in the US, but I think it's a great idea that, yeah, we may see more conversation about in the future. I think that'd be great.
Okay, great. So the next question is for Valentin. I found your reflection on your own process helpful and inspiring. And it was, by the way, I love this idea of intentional collaboration. So the question is, what suggestion would you have for sharing your key insight and tips more broadly? And what advice would you have for those just getting started with international research?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of what advice is, this has to be something that you really want to do, right? It has to be intentional, and it takes time, and it takes a lot of time that it's not short-term gain, right? It's a long-term potential. I mean, like as if you look at all the examples I gave, I mean, there were a lot of unsuccessful funding proposals that took a lot of time. There were a lot of paperwork associated with bringing one visiting scholar or another one, and it all takes time, and you don't see the gain in 1 year or 2 years. I mean, there are some publications that came out of this, for instance, but were after 2 and 3 years of the collaboration. So you have to be patient, you have to be intentional, and you have to know that it takes time. So in a way, you have to balance. I mean, if you're in the middle of your tenure process and you have to put some of the effort, most of your effort really on the short-term gain. That's how the system forces you to do, right? But keeping some time, some energy into the long-term collaborations, because I think when you look back, wow, that really accounts for a lot. How to share this more broadly? Well, I think that knowing, I think one very important thing is getting the support from the administrative support from CALS Global, and having the example of, okay, there's many different options to have collaborations, and from completely unfunded to very large grants, everything in between, and from different things. I mean, and maybe giving examples so that people can get inspired. It's a way of sharing that. The other thing is also training the people who's helping in CALS Global and in the academic departments also, how important these collaborations are, and how bringing these visiting scholars and working on the paperwork and the visa and the contract and whatever, it really has an important meaning for the mission of UW in the long term, right? So that's what I would reflect.
Oh, great. And just as a reminder as well, like James was the awardee of the Global Garden Award. So he used that to do his research. So to continue on, like we have a next question for Valentin, this time on the research aspect. Have you done any cross-case research site comparison? And if yes, are there any unifying challenges with this case now?
Well, as part of the project with France, we will have a comparison of cases. We haven't, I mean, given the nature of like really very, I wouldn't say random, but like heterogeneous nature of all the different countries, we haven't done a cross-country comparison. I think that's the next step. I mean, once we have cultivated these relationships and we have, collaborators that are interested and that are engage, I think now we can go to the next step, which is doing some studies that are cross, the same study in different countries and getting data together, but that would require funding for sure. I mean, and that's where you really need the commitment of the funding. Yeah.
So similar again for Valentine's. Don't worry, James, I have questions for you as well. The question is like, have you seen a pushback from seed companies that rely on farmers to come back every year to buy their seeds with this case now?
Well, I don't think we're at the point that perennial grains are a big challenge for big seed companies yet. Yes, there's not a lot of interest because the business of the seed companies is to sell seed, and if you develop a crop that is planted only once for several years, it would be. But I don't think we're at the point right now that maybe in the future it would be. But right now we actually have a lot of support from large food companies like General Mills, which is the largest cereal company in the US and in the world, and they are very interested in the potential of more. They are all into bees, and they are all into environmental conservation and stuff, and so they are interested in this alternative. So
okay, so it's like the question that I have for James is, with your technology of tracking the bees, could you use that like to inform agricultural practice, meaning like this is the area where you should be planting versus this area, etc. like thinking about future knowledge that you can build with tracking the bees.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the sort of long-term goals of a lot of the tools that I talked about. And so, especially within the, what I sort of showed of being able to follow the behaviors of bumblebees, what we're really interested in there is trying to understand how different kinds of agricultural stressor, like the kinds of stressors that bees experience in agroecosystems, right? Like agrochemical exposure, sometimes more extreme temperatures, drought, what do those actually do to bees? So that can inform, one of the things we're very explicitly working on is thinking of that as a tool that we could use, in the US, but also across the globe for improving pesticide regulation, which, to summarize a long history into one sentence, has totally failed to keep pollinators and other insects safe from harm from agrochemicals. And there are some methodological reasons that really sit under that to some extent. So one thing that we're very interested in is trying to use what we see as exciting emerging technologies to better understand what agrochemicals do to bees, and that could hopefully be incorporated into the improved regulation. But then also, especially, and this is really new stuff that we're just in the first baby steps of. We're certainly on the other end, as Valentin was describing, sort of trying to put feelers out for long-term growth. That's definitely the stage that we're in. But we're very excited about being able to actually use some of these tools to go out into natural environments, monitor the diversity and abundance of pollinators. And we think that could be a really powerful tool for informing management decisions too. So we can get at some of these practical questions of, okay, if in this crop you put this kind of composition of wildflowers next to it, what do you actually get out of that in terms of quantifiable improved pollination visits, and what does that mean for yields? We can put that into really practical terms that matter and can inform decision making. Certainly, again, we're very much in the early stages of that, but that's where we really want to go with those tools.
Okay, so like maybe like one more question, and then I will turn back to Jennifer to wrap up before we end. So, Valentin, your question, I give you like 1 minute to answer it, and it will be like, what role do you see for the Land Institute and other aligned organizations in globalizing the perennial agriculture and mission?
I see a very important role there, and actually they are actively now starting a new initiative. It's called New Roots International, and it's exactly doing this. It's really trying to promote connections and promote research partners around the world. So I think that in the near future we're going to see a lot more of this, and definitely there's an important role in in reducing uncertainty for the researchers and promoting connections among researchers on this topic. So yeah, there's a very important role there. And the maximum yield of Kernza, it's about 1,000 kilograms per hectare, and really, it's a third or a fourth of what annual wheat yields. But we're moving slowly into greater yields.
Okay, fantastic. So we have like a remaining question, but I will encourage those participants to directly email like James and Valentin. That was the goal of this conversation, to catalyze like discussion and collaboration. So with that, like Jennifer, like I'll give you the floor.
Great, thank you so much. This has been incredibly interesting. Unfortunately, we didn't get to all of the questions. As Orly mentioned, the idea with the series is really to catalyze and sustain these conversations. So we have the contact information from our distinguished guests here. I did want to thank our distinguished guests and our moderator and our co-sponsors and all of you, as well as the collaborators. I noticed some of the research collaborators from our speakers are with us today. So thank you for joining us. Please do feel free to reach out to the presenters themselves with the follow-up, any conversation with them. And do also please tune in for our upcoming conversations. You can find more information and the registration on our CALS Global website. The next one is December 15th. With that, without further ado, I suppose, thank you all, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thank you again,
Very
everyone.
much.
Bye.